Hello, my name is Zachary Doyle, and today is Friday, April 13th, and this is my interview video on Erikson's psychosocial stages of development.
Imagine I've never heard of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Could you briefly explain salient features of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development? And what is the source of this information?
So, the Erikson theory of psychosocial development revolves around 8 stages of development that every individual will go through at one point in their life or another, and each of these stages may affect the individual differently, more so or less so. The 8 stages start with
trust versus mistrust, which is typically in an individual birth through 18 months. Second stage is autonomy versus doubt, 18 months to 3 years old. Initiative versus guilt is the third stage, ranging from 3 to 6 years. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority, which is typically 6 years to 12 years. Stage 5 is identity versus role confusion, typically 12 to 18 years old. Stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation, typically the young adulthood range. Stage 7, generativity versus self-absorption, typically labeled as the middle adulthood. And the last stage, integrity versus despair, which is the late adulthood stage.
one last point to note is that typically the first 3 stages of development revolve around a familial and parental influence, while stage 4 and 5 is mainly influenced by school peers and fellow classmates and teachers. I got all this information from the 12th edition of Educational Psychology, Theory and Practice by Robert Slavin.
At what stage of development do you see yourself now? Why do you think so?
I would place myself in a transitional phase between stage 6 and stage 7. I say that mainly because, as I referenced in my first response, every individual is affected by these stages differently or go through different experiences that lead to confronting these individual stage crises at a different place in life. So I'm not married. I'm 26 years old, and that alone would classify me into stage 6 by way and by means of Erikson's psychosocial stage of development. However, I've been working with children and knew that that was what I wanted to do for years, and that generativity of wanting to teach and educate and guide the next generation places me in stage 7. So that is kind of 2 approaches as to why I believe parts of me are stage 6 and parts of me are stage 7.
Explain how being at this stage of development may influence your behavior and outlook in the classroom. On what do you base this explanation?
Well, because I classify myself in 2 different stages, I have a little bit more to talk about. Stage 6 is primarily based on sharing your life with another individual. Now, because I don't have a significant other right now, and I'm in pursuit of a career that formulates around generativity, I'm able to, in my mind, take that companionship element to my life and apply it to my teaching so that I have a little bit more time and dedication that I can spend on my profession and guiding these new students and this new generation into fruition. Because one aspect of Erikson's psychosocial stage of development is that there's always an antithesis to this goal of each stage. So stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation. So I'm trying to save myself from isolation by using the intimacy of my work to fill that gap. And in stage 7, we have generativity versus self-absorption. So I'm trying to use my job, which the generativity has come pretty naturally to me because I've been doing it forever. So I'm taking this generativity, and that is filling the void that self-absorption is trying to take over. So I'm able to kind of balance those 2 stages to help me and to help solve the crisis that each of them present to me.
Identify at what level your students are likely to be at in Erikson's stages.
So the main age group of students that I'd like to work with are elementary level. So that would generally classify them into stage 4 in Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, typically ages 6 through 12. Now, the main crisis here in stage 4, which is labeled industry versus inferiority, is a student's discovery of success and failure in relation to themselves. So success and failure start to become more influential in their lives. So a student that might not be succeeding in day-to-day activities or in sports or tests or in any aspect of their life, this failure can start to stick to that student and start to create poor learning tendencies that can be taken on later in life. But vice versa, with success, students that are showing success and are experiencing that get that gratification and they see that payoff for their hard work, which then can create good learning tendencies. Another aspect of this stage that is particularly notable is this is the first stage where the primary influencing factor for the individual student is no longer family or parents. It's stepped more into a peer-related influence and a student, fellow classmate-related influence, and teachers becoming a primary influencer in the student's life. So it's just important to be cognizant of that as an educator, that this is the first stage where your teaching can really start to influence the future of your students.
Explain how being at this stage of development may influence their behavior and outlook in your classroom. And on what do you base this explanation?
Primarily, it's going to be a student realizing how their work compares to everyone else's in the classroom. Going back to my previous response, success and failure becomes much more important in this stage in regards to the individual. It becomes more important to the student to see success or to see failure. And these two concepts become much more influential in a day-to-day life. And so a student that is failing is going to be, sometimes surrounded by students that are succeeding, and there may be confusion as to why that is. Why am I failing and these other students succeeding? And so there needs to be awareness of this as an educator, to encourage students that may not be succeeding every time to keep trying and to learn from failure, so that we don't develop these negative and these poor learning tendencies later on in our educational path.
What might be some disconnects between you and your students, keeping the differences in the two stages in mind?
Responses. I think developing the proper way to view failure as a class is going to be a particularly difficult challenge for me as an educator, and just being cognizant and very aware of my students' learning tendencies, whether they're good or bad, and to enforce them or to encourage maybe a different approach to a challenging problem might be beneficial. It's just very important to set your students up for success later on in their learning career, and it's important not to leave certain connotations in a student's work that might lead back to the negative tendencies that I was talking about previously.
Any final comment?
The only thing that I found particularly interesting about Erikson's psychosocial stages of development was it was very eye-opening for me, not having known anything about this, to be able to determine where I was in this stage of life that's been very explicitly mapped out. However, after reading all the stages, being that I classified myself in two different stages, I think it's important to note that this is just a single approach to a social development of an individual, and that it doesn't necessarily take into consideration all the factors of life that go into the development of a social consciousness and a psyche. So I just think it's important to note that it's a great resource to reference and maybe to generalize a class and to know generally where your students are and where to work. But I think to use it as a rule of thumb and an all-encompassing approach to social consciousness, I think would be a little much.